I probably don't need to tell you this, but Alexis Wright is a member of the Waanyi Nation of the Southern Highlands in the Gulf of Carpentaria. Her books include Grog War, a study of alcohol abuse in Tennant Creek, and the novels Plain of Promise and Carpentaria, which won the Miles Franklin Literary Award, the Victorian and Queensland Premiers Awards, and the ALS Gold Medal, and was published in the US, UK, China, and Italy, France, Spain, and Poland. She's a distinguished fellow in the University of Western Sydney's Writing and Society Research Centre and is generally a very busy writer indeed. Thank you for taking the time, Alexis. Can we start by having you read whatever it is you'd like from the Swan Book as a way in?
Yes, thank you, Geordie, and thank you for coming. And I wish to acknowledge the traditional homeland of the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation, and great privilege to be here today and talking about the Swan Book. So yeah, I'll be happy to read. I'll probably go there. Okay. What I was going to read today from the Swan Book is it's a Saturday morning, and probably just a light piece from the book about Rigoletto the monkey, and who has a job to do, but he's not very happy about the job that he's been given. So I'll find this page here, and this is in a flooded city where he's supposed to be looking after Oblivia, who's the main character of this book, who's an Aboriginal girl who is a young woman now, but she's mute, she doesn't speak, and this is on the eve of quite catastrophic events happening in her life. So this is Rigoletto. Rigoletto is a monkey from Asia, a white monkey, and a very, very furry monkey. And he's the pet of the harbour master, who is an Aboriginal spiritual man, and who's widely travelled. But he's you can read him as you like, as being there and not being there, as a spiritual man, like a spirit, and like a healer, and which he is, who has the capacity to move and be wherever he likes. And this is the flooded city after king tides bring in, and this novel is set in 100 years from now, and looking at ideas of global warming and some of the things that scientists are telling us about what could happen. And this is a flooded city street. Any little monkey could rattle off a literary of worse things happening in his world, but Rigoletto sat with steely red face on the dragon and thought very seriously about prescribed responsibility as the worst kind of thing that could have happened to him. It was the only problem he had of being a pet monkey. He knew that he was supposed to step in like a man instead of just being a monkey and become the girl's guardian if the harbour master was not around, although very clearly he recognised that the act of guardianship over others did not come naturally to him. He hated being trained to act responsibly. There was nothing in it. He was not the harbour master's pet monkey by any stretch of the imagination. It was moments like these where a few guilty pangs forced Rigoletto to forget he was supposed to be a pet by acting like a wild animal. A wild animal was not supposed to look after people. It was supposed to be the other way around. Where was the beauty in a monkey worrying about people? His brain bolted from the reality of floating down a flooded city street on a magnificent but ruined dragon. This is a big Chinese dragon you bring out for festivals. His idea of beauty lay tens of thousands of kilometres away, where long-necked swans forage for insects in muddy rice fields with the swallows in a world that enjoyed listening to exquisite plum blossom music being played on a bamboo flute. He held this thought. He hummed through bubble gum sticking between his clicking teeth and did not lose any sense of the flute's musicality in his own rendition of the plum and cherry blossom music that he had locked in his head. These were only the delusional thoughts of a monkey that had enough troubles occupying his mind than to be bothered with fantasies being projected on him by the harbour master like, "You poor old good monkey." He had the worries of 1,000 monkeys, so da-da-dee-da and la-la-la. Presently, aloft on the dragon, his main worry was the soaking wet Rigoletto jacket. Would it shrink on his furry body and strangle him? A monkey sitting on a dragon in the middle of some common big storm or climate change rising sea levels event was nothing to worry about. He hugged himself tight. Rigoletto had seen flooding on seaboard city streets all over the world. It was really just as natural as seeing water flooding in the lanes of Venice, Bangladesh or Pakistan. "Where are you, harbour master? You got to come back." Rigoletto's experience of global warming was academic, not practical. He remained on guard while Olivia continued to be dragged along with the dragon through the water, knowing that very soon she would be found. She was part of the most important story happening in the world right now. There could be no other way for the girl wife if she survived. And I just wanted to just continue reading another small part of the funeral for her husband, who is Warren Finch, who becomes the president here of the Republic of Australia in 100 years' time. It was a terrific funeral. Everyone was saying how marvellous it was. Best speeches, good old people's song like "Through the Ages I Will Remember Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain." "Someday when we meet up yonder, we will stroll hand in hand again." Still the best bloke, that old Hank Williams, and others like him. But things took a turn for the worst after that. And I will go just here. All the services for the dearly beloved, the mourning, the last respects, country and western music, hymns and special foreign music were heard continuously and on a daily basis. In actual fact, nobody thought a thing about the consequences of unabated mourning. Certainly no one questioned the excessiveness of sorrow and whether there was going to be an end point of mourning for Warren Finch. That was until finally, one day in the middle of a lot of smoke, what looked like most of the countrymen's wildflowers and gum leaves arrived with scores of his ceremonial elders from his Aboriginal government, and they sung his whirl. They said that they were smoking his spirit back to their own traditional country. His spirit was no longer in this place. This was when the sky practically fell down, when these people, his own people, wanted to remove the coffin from the cathedral. Total pandemonium broke out between all the different types of mourners until officials 1, 2 and 3, with more to follow, told these cheeky people from the bush or some far-flung part of the country with an unpronounceable name that nobody had ever heard of, that Warren Finch's importance as a man far outweighed any of their cultural considerations, and peace, brother, go in peace, let that be the end of the matter. Yet it was a stalemate. These people from the bush would not listen to anybody. They would not leave the coffin, and they just stood there amongst the choir singing and made even greater smoke with their leaves, even though anybody could see that a long queue was forming behind them, with urgent people becoming very irate. The bush people wanted to talk about culture. No, ears were not listening. Ears were only listening to the church choir. Everybody wanted to get firm now about this disturbance. These people These Aboriginal people were told to stop being un-Australian and to leave. Their time was up. Did they not understand that everybody had to take equal turns to stand next to the coffin? Move on. Why? The Aboriginal elders asked. His spirit is gone now, up in country. But their explanation would never do. Even if Warren Finch lay dead in his coffin, he was still head of state until somebody else could take his place. Was that possible? Yes. He could still give advice and blessings to his government, just like he did when he was alive. And even though he was dead, he would always be one of the most loved world leaders that ever existed in the history of mankind. How could anyone argue about this? Who could replace him? The more his Aboriginal people argued and argued, persisting it was right to take his body home. And though his body was like that of a normal body of a kinsman and should be given the proper burial, the more they were treated like selfish people, and the more the idea of a final resting place became full of contention and attributed to the whole country's denial that Warren Finch was really dead, when they preferred to think of him as just sleeping like Sleeping Beauty. Well, grass grew, and the bushfolk had made a permanent campsite beside the coffin in the cathedral. Finally, in a nasty episode of August, there was a string of official and much publicised questions raised about who these Aboriginal people were. Who did they think themselves? And why had they turned up in the first place? And who had given them room to do native things without permission in the most important cathedral in the country, making everything feel tainted in their sorrow? Were they really Aboriginal? Did they really belong to Warren Finch's ancestral country? And anthropologists, lawyers and other experts like archaeologists, sociologists and historians were called to examine the genealogies of these people. An emergency legislation was bulldozed through Parliament in the dead of night, which claimed that Warren Finch was the blood relative of every Australian, which gave power to the government to decide where he was to be buried. Ha ha ha. Roland laughter because it was funny and thought inconceivable that Warren Finch could be buried in some wilderness place with no public access, where only a handful of Aboriginal people who knew the country would know how to get to his grave and say some prayers that they had made up themselves. There would be national prayers in time, legislated in a national Warren Finch prayer book. Would you trust Aboriginal people to stick to Australian law? The police were obliged under the regulations of emergency laws to intervene in the lives of all Aboriginal people, to throw the bush people out of the cathedral. Then, when there were no words left and nowhere to live in a city that despised the presence of Aboriginal people, Warren Finch's clanspeople went home. Thank you.
Well, I hope you have some sense of what you're getting yourselves in for if you haven't read the Swan Book. It's utterly fantastic. It is absurd, it's satirical, it's funny, it's tragic, and it's about clashing ideologies, clashing cultures, clashing ontologies, clashing ways of being in the world, bodied forth, and I think that was a really apt place to read from. Literally, architecturally, this fight within the cathedral, the home of Western culture, between those who would take the body up country of our first Indigenous president and those who would keep it as an object of political use. But the whole book, it seems, is about that particular blending, that particular clash. And in terms of the very shape of the novel, that Christian or the secularized scientific residue of that Christian era has been the master key in which the European novel has been told.
Yes.
Swan Book is not like that.
No.
How do you go about taking the cathedral of the European novel apart and reassembling it in a way that's more amenable to your own needs?
Judy, I think it's been it's been a journey in doing that and working towards the books Carpentaria and the Swan Book. My first attempt at writing a novel was Plains of Promise many years ago, and I really felt that structure of what you just explained didn't suit me as an Aboriginal person.
So you felt that
my
tension
background.
right from the beginning, and
I
we're
felt
talking
that.
about back in 97?
In the 90s, yeah, when I started writing, and my whole background and the work that I've done and my experience and well who I am and I had to look at writing, from across the world, to try and understand how I could attempt to write these type of books and Carpentaria and building on that for the Swan Book, and that journey took me through writers here in India and Africa and Ireland and Europe, everywhere, and I'm still looking in the French Caribbean. Patrick Chamusset's big book Texaco, and the follow-up book Solobo Magnificent, and Carlos Fuentes, South American writer, and I mean I really enjoy the discovery of writers from across the world, and I wanted particularly in the journey for Carpentaria, I wanted to write an authentic novel that was authentic to my homeland in the Gulf of Carpentaria, that was faithful in lots of ways to lots of realities, the country itself, the way the country speaks, and culture, our cultural relationship with the country, and the realities of people, because you can't. And it's a very complex thing. To me, and that's I talked about the other day about the idea of writing a book like the Swan Book or Carpentaria. The Carpentaria was more like trying to write to the ancestors of the country, telling a story to the ancestors about what we're doing now, how we're travelling. This is what's happening. A story to them, or as well as a story to the future, and to the future generations who may not be reading the book right now, but may read and say, well, what were they doing? What were they thinking? In the last decades of the last century, and didn't they stand up for themselves? Didn't they fight? And did they have any culture left? And so that in the Swan Book is taking that project further, and in thinking about, well, what if? And I started the process of we're going back again. It's a blending of all times, and I've talked about that before as well. It's like a multi-stranded helix of all times, and that's the kind of work that suits me as for a person who I am, and from my background, and what I'm trying to do is blending of all times in this country, not just taking one little story, one little element, because I think it is a complex world, and we're really moving into very complex times, and it's been like that for Aboriginal people for a very long time, and is that we have to bring in lots of elements in the work, and that's a complexity as well as the simplicity and
well, I was going to say, this is the paradox really of your work, because here you are saying, I'm writing this book to preserve for future Indigenous generations, to say this is what we were doing to maintain our culture, and yet to do so you are looking for models from the global elsewhere.
That's right.
Now, is that a tricky thing to manage? Do you feel that in some way that you are doing a disservice to the source culture by importing other stories from other cultures? Or is it just the most pragmatic way to keep that source culture alive and going?
I think the source culture is alive and going, and to try to explain the source culture and the complexity of the source culture, you have to look throughout the world to find ways of doing it, and because it's not an easy thing. It's in ways of explaining, and I talk about you with the Swan Book, looking at Telekavano's his last work, which was 6 memos for the new millennium, the writing needed for the new millennium, and which was only 5 essays because he didn't manage to write the last one, and he wanted to write more apparently, but and I tried to see if the Swan Book matched that, and the ideas that he was talking about, and they were, the lightness and the complexity, the multiplicity, and something I think might have been integrity, and there was something else, but those all those elements, I hope and like to think they're in the Swan Book because they also match. The Aboriginal world of storytelling, and that they have all those elements. And I talked about it's an Aboriginal an inquest or an inquiry when something goes wrong, when someone might die, to find out what happened, who's responsible, and you bring in all those elements. It's not clear cut, and it's multiple, and it's also light, and because there is that lightness in our world too, which Kavina describes of the shaman being able to travel long distances to be able to shed the burden, and I don't want to carry the burden either, and I don't think we do. We do carry the burden, but we also have the ability to unload it or make it lighter, and that's very innate in the Aboriginal world. And
for those of you who aren't familiar with the book that Alexis is referring to, Italo Calvino's final, and I think unfinished, collection of lectures or long essays called 6 Memos for the New Millennium. It's an absolutely wonderful book. But as you were speaking, I was thinking about interviewing Kim Scott, next door peer, a few years back, where I was asking him questions about European ideas of our sense that Indigenous cultures were static. And he said, Indigenous cultures have never been static and they've never been closed to outside influences. No. And he was speaking about that Deadman dance and the songs of his people that incorporated the visits of American whalers in those very early years prior to European settlement. But at the same time...
There's traditional stories too about Cyclone Tracy, and that are incorporated. This is a ceremony about Cyclone Tracy, and we do see connections. We are connected to the world. Through my work over a long period of time before I started writing was researching in for organisations that I work for in the Aboriginal world, and we were very progressive. We were fighting for rights in this country, for Indigenous rights to happen, and we were very progressive. We were looking at Indigenous rights and legal issues across the world. It was huge issues, but we were taking all those things on.
Well, now looking back, I mean, this is an interesting point that you raise, because your first book, Grog Wars, is a work of, distinctly non-fictional. It is an intervention into the political and social realm, and it's strict, empirically based, just the facts, man.
Yes.
Then you write a novel. And this shift to fiction, when so much, obviously, of your early work is based on the facts, seems odd. What happens in between to lead you to feel that you should be writing fiction rather than these non-fiction accounts?
We just go back to you're talking about progressiveness in our world. I can remember, I wanted to tell you the story because it was something that just came in my mind as well, of Dick Ruffsey, who passed away now, from Mornington Island, very strong, lardle man and famous painter. And he really prided himself that he could speak the Queen's language better than any Australian. And he could. And he was like an English gentleman up on Mornington Island, and he spoke like a lord, and he did, and he was very progressive, but he'd learned how to speak like that, and but it was, he got a lot of respect for it too. And got treated like a lord.
Well, you yourself, I think you were telling me that that your role as a writer actually began quite early, and it was due to certain skills that you had that became responsibilities for the wider community. Could you tell us a little bit about that kind of early transition from being a member of the community to a spokesperson for it?
Well, I when I was quite a young woman, and I was in northwest Queensland and working in the Gulf. I had, at that time, a little bit more education than a lot of our elders, and they were very concerned that we carried our own responsibilities ourselves, and they took me on board as a young person with wild thoughts and thinking I could fix the world up in a minute, and if not today, tomorrow at least, and and they really taught me to listen. And to they made me do all their writing for them for meetings, which would go on for ages. Some of their meetings, and they'd want every word written down faithfully, every word that they said, and I would, because I was very fast, writing notes, and or they spoke very slow, and. So and I learned to listen, and I really think that's what they were trying to teach me, to hear, and if you heard, and you might start learning something, and you might learn to understand, and it might be of some use in the future, and I'm really grateful that for that early training, and that's where my real education started, and I've learned both ways. You learn through their teachings, their stories, and their understanding, and their gift really to what they've given me, and also learning through studying and because and that I was pushed in that direction as well, because we were taking on such huge issues of mining on our land, and land rights, and protection of sacred sites, and you name it, we were doing it, and that meant you had to find out. You had to find out everything you possibly could, and learn, and then you had to seek widely. You couldn't depend on what was just happening here in Australia.
But in say white Australian culture, you have this sense of the world is organised to your needs, to your wants, to your aims, to be a spokesperson for that Australia is a role that you can just step away from because 1,000 others will do it. That every bit of media floating in the air around you, all the images, all support your idea of yourself. But as a member of a marginal or beleaguered community, there must be a terrible burden that is placed upon you in the sense that if I don't do this, I don't know who will. Was that something that you've had to grapple with over time? Have there been moments where you've just thought, oh, blow this, I just want to rest?
It's hard to rest. You don't really have the room to rest. Not when you're in our shoes. You can't look at what's happening and not feel that you some sense of you need to be able to do something if you possibly can do it. With going back to your question before about the change to fiction, in this Grog Wars, there are some fictional chapters in that book, and that was because when I was doing the research in Tennant Creek and working with people in Tennant Creek, the Warramunga people there, and it's Jalali Council who asked me to do that book. There were people who I did at that same time. I was doing another book, essays on 20 years of land rights in Central Australia, collecting, compiling a lot of essays and stories where people were very proud to talk about their involvement, their struggle, their fight, and their commitment to gaining their land back. But the issue about grog and the terrible things and the destruction of grog in our communities, people wanted those stories told in fiction. They didn't want
So there are protocols. There are an extra series of protocols that you have to negotiate.
Yes.
So is that
was
fiction permits you a certain amount of freedom,
and fiction does give me that freedom to be able to speak about a lot of things, and also to give me the independence that I need to write. I mean, I think I've always sought to be independent, and in our movement we sought independence, and so being independent, being free is a very strong element in me, and so fiction does give me the freedom to explore issues and to tell the stories in the way that they need to be told, because we do restrict ourselves in non-fiction, particularly in the Aboriginal world, in the stories that will be heard, and stories that will be kept. And that goes across cultural issues, social issues, and a lot of things.
So you've been based over the years all along the East Coast, Sydney and Melbourne, what have you, but you've continually gone back to the Gulf country. How does your community, or those you remain close to, what do they feel about the project that you've undertaken, these novels? Is it something that they approve of, or is there questions surrounding it?
No one's approached me with questions surrounding it. There seems to be great pride in the fact that I write and are producing these books, and the book is doing well. It's produced a great sense of pride in the Aboriginal world and people in the Gulf. The book has gone back there in many shapes and forms, as well as myself, and people are very happy that as far as I know, they see it as a positive thing, and we do see the achievements of our people in positive terms. I think if I was talking in my books about that Aboriginal ceremonies is bullshit, like we heard the other day, from an Aboriginal leader, that wouldn't be acceptable. But I don't do that.
Well, I mean, one of the things about the Swan Book is, at its heart, is an Indigenous leader named Warren Finch, whose funeral you hear described, who's a man who has become a kind of an archetypal wrong kind of Indigenous leader. And that seems to me, it's something that you note, that it's very tricky to take up roles of leadership. There are questions of what degree you give yourself up to the dominant modes of, politics or media or culture in order to get your message across. Tell us a bit about Warren and his creation, what he's intended to represent.
Warren Finch, he comes from the neighbouring clan group of a very large Indigenous Aboriginal nation, and on one side is Oblivia, the young girl, and who's got a very troubled background.
Oblivia's people they don't have any of the goods and the wealth of the Brolga people who adjoin their land, precisely because they've said no to mining and no to certain government largesse.
Yes, that's right. And they both have Aboriginal government, which is something I wanted to particularly put in this book, because this is a conversation that we've never been able to have in this country, the idea of Aboriginal self-government, and where Aboriginal nations can have a vision for the future and be able to work towards that vision and feel responsible for it, and without someone treating us like children. And but so they belong to two neighbouring Aboriginal nations, even though they're part of one big area and they're related to one another. So the Brolga people are I describe it in the book. They're yes people. They're yes people to whatever it is, and they've done very well from saying yes, and where the other group had not so forthcoming with their of saying yes to things, and so they are very poor and on the margin. So. But Warren is a gift from God. The Brolga people they see this young boy as a gift from God. He's very smart. He's very clever. He's beautiful in every possible way. And they train him and very precise sort of training to be able to survive on his country and to learn from his country. And he's a lot of his teaching is out is separate. It's out in the bush in this beautiful country of spinifex and Brolga's dancing, and he studies Brolga movements, and he learns from that, and he grows up, and he's because he's so wonderful and so smart. He's also becomes a clear target for what,
He's so full of possibility, isn't he?
Yeah, he's so full of possibility that the world grabs him, and he's taken away. He goes with it, and he loses his ability to have a sense of his own country and his own people anymore.
The world in which is set, say, a century hence, the coastal fringe is being inundated, and the only parts of society that haven't sort of collapsed are the 1%ers, and there's some fairly savage stuff in there from you. But to me, that seems an image of Sydney, a phantasmagoric kind of image. And thinking about the kind of books that you've been reading that have informed your writing, you'd be tempted to call what you're doing magical realism. But I think that that's a slightly problematic term when it comes to your writing. Would you accept the term magical realism, or are there problems there?
I think that term is pretty old-fashioned, and in today's world of literature, where we have writing, from all over the world, and it takes many shapes and forms, and it comes with many beliefs and ways of seeing the world. It's and 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 someone's reality is may not be your reality or my reality, and but if someone has a different way of seeing the world, is that magic realism? And in the Aboriginal world, there's different realities, different ways of seeing things, and thank goodness. Thank goodness.
Well, I was going to say, encoded in the term magical realism is the suggestion that there's a kind of hierarchy. There are departures from a realism, which is the standard, the norm, which you've departed from, but it's not the real, which is determined by somebody else.
Yes.
But what seems particularly stunning in your book, which is a work that, at its heart, it's dealing with issues of climate change, is the notion that the land itself might be an agent, might have a sense of character or some independent existence of the human agents that move through it. Does an Indigenous sense of the land hold possibilities for new ways of telling story?
Well, for new ways of telling stories, but it's always told stories. This land has always told stories. There's stories, that are thousands of years old and many stories, for every Aboriginal area. There's thousands of stories that are there, and that's and if someone who lives in that in those stories, that's a whole worldview and reality, and that's part of the problem of relationships that we're having right now between Australian, and non-Indigenous Australians, and is that we can't, we're not connecting because of those different realities of understanding this country. And the Aboriginal understanding is deep, and it comes from stories that are thousands of years old. And if you're living that reality, that's the real reality, and everything else is the reality too. But but you have that safeguard of having your own cultural reality around you.
We think about European traditions of writing place in the Australian context, from your early explorers to Randolph Stowe. There's a sense of emptiness, the unstoried nature of the inland. One of the shocks of your book is it's the fecundity of life, of image, of idea. Are those two traditions, is it possible to reconcile them?
One day. Hopefully. I was saying in the session last night with Alice Walker, the only real conversations that we've been able to have in this country, the ones that where Australia is having a real conversation with the Aboriginal people, has been through the courts, and that's the only time. And if it's a prolonged and extracted land rights case that's taken 20 years when it could have taken 1 year, and in the Northern Territory, most of those land rights cases in the Northern Territory took years. Of fighting and argument, and native title Mabo, that took years, but that was a conversation about rights and property rights, and it may well be that that's where we have to go back in the future to have a real conversation about the future, and
But
But I don't know about, and then when we do and have, and we can move together in the future, there may be more openness to one another. One would hope that, but at the moment, and it's not for me to say.
Yeah.
I can't say because the way I see it is the way a lot of Aboriginal people see it. We got a long road to go yet, and
well, when we look,
I don't know how to do it.
when we look in literary terms at European efforts to approximate or bridge some kind of cultural divide, and I think back to the Jindy Warrabak poets, and I think of Xavier Herbert and his acts of appropriation.
Yes.
These have often been subsequently criticised for that kind of presumption. So it seems to me the difficulty is if there is a profound gap between our ability to communicate those issues, then it's about Indigenous Australia coming to white Australia with that news rather than white Australia attempting to kind of take it from them. And that's a slow process.
It is a slow process. No, I don't have the answers. I don't have the answers for everything. And all I'm trying to do at the moment is write the work that I'm doing, and with something like the Swan Book, that takes years of work and research and understanding to try to put it together. A book like this I've described as trying to work on a huge construction site single-handedly and trying to put something together that's a huge building in a way, and trying to do it. So it takes that sort of effort and concentration. And same with the Carpentaria in that way, and probably be the same for my next book. But for the answers for how other people will write the Aboriginal story or how we do it together, we need to find out ways of being together. But and I don't think it should come from Aboriginal people as such either. Yeah, I think we've tried very hard to have that conversation, and we're still trying. You'll see people everywhere trying to do this and trying to do that and trying to do something else, and we're trying, but we're nowhere near where we should be, and well, maybe that's all right, but to me, it's not, because there's things happening on the ground that makes it very hard for us. And, I can see things slipping away, and so that's a big
Well, at
problem.
least, the Swan Book is the kind of book that gives us cause for optimism, because it does seem to me to create a space where Aboriginal and European cosmologies can actually meet and merge. I think at this stage we should open it to you guys. No doubt you have questions for Alexis. We've got some microphones going round, so please ask away. Lady there in the blue.
Thank you very much, Alexis and Geordie, for your very interesting conversation. Alexis, I just wanted to ask you about why swans? Your swans are very cosmopolitan birds. They've got European histories, and they come to occupy a very important role, of course, in the novel, and they're Oblivia's companions and vehicles. And can you talk a little bit about the swan and why you chose that bird?
I don't know, and where the swans came from in the first place, because the idea for writing this book was way back in 2002, 2003, and I should take better notes. than I do. And I think it could have been something as simple as reading a newspaper article about swans at a time when there were quite, very serious things happening in the Aboriginal world, and the things that I was helping people to work with in Central Australia, and that was in terms of Aboriginal self-government, and a huge idea that just couldn't go anywhere with the status quo at the time, and just thought it was just really impossible to break out of the walls even if you wanted to, and also it was a time of Howard breaking down some of the stronger elements in the Aboriginal political world, and I have certain beliefs and principles and understanding, and I thought at the time, some of what people were saying, and these are very respectful elders, I was working with across Central Australia. If their vision couldn't be heard of how to move towards the future and be responsible for the future, and all our work has always been about the future and the future of our children, all of it. And though in John Howard's time we were accused of not thinking about the future and caring for our children or loving our children, but way back then I was thinking, what could I do? Would I spend the next? I wanted to write a new book, but I thought, well, do I write a book about John Howard? And think about him every day, for years, for 10 years, and I'll be sick, and it wouldn't last. And or would I take swans? I chose swans. Yeah.
Yes, sorry, at the back. Lady in white.
Hello. Could you let me know who told you stories when you were a child?
Yes, very easy. My grandmother. My grandmother told me stories, and she told stories to the family. And I spent a lot of time with my grandmother as a young child, and walking around country with her, around riverbanks, and people. She'd visit people camping on the riverbank. She lived on the edge of town herself in a corrugated iron house, and with dirt floors. And but she was a really fantastic gardener, and but she was also a storyteller. She told stories, and at night time, family members would come down to her place, or they might have been down for lunch or something, and in the evening they would sit around outside because it was always hot, where we came from, and you'd sit around outside and tell stories and talk about things and places and beliefs, and and something happening to somebody because of something happened, and that connection made to the spiritual world as well. And so I heard all that when I was a small child, while I was winding up the record player, playing music to them, and country and western music, Rick and Thel and Johnny Cash and Slim Dusty. My mother's records, I think.
This lady in the second row here.
Yes, thank you. I'm just wondering, I'm late 60s now, but I'm just so much learning. Growing up in Sydney, I only ever had one Aboriginal friend when I was about 18, 19 years old. She almost led the life of an Yvonne Goolagong, brought in from the country and lived with a very well-to-do family in a North Shore suburb. I was with a working class factory working dad. So she'd almost come from a country isolated town to this world I didn't know about. So we learnt about that she wasn't happy staying in Sydney. But growing up, one Aboriginal friend. But now I notice my granddaughters and 2 other friends who are grandmothers, we spoke this week, our granddaughters are now going on school excursion in year 11 to Arnhem Land, to Alice Springs. So that never happened in those other generations. They took them to France and Egypt. So, you know, I can see the knocking on the door. And I volunteered at a college in Alice Springs with Aboriginal children, and I brought all those stories back to my grandchildren. But I think we just don't know. We live in the city and we don't know that world. So, so much learning, and I'm so pleased that our grandchildren are now, you know, they're getting right into it and learning. So maybe it'll be their generation.
Yes.
Do you see evidence of that, Alexis?
Yeah, no. There are a lot of connections that have been made now, and a lot of people are trying to learn and to, you know, for this country to be a better country, where it's more accepting, you know, of each other, and that we do, you know, to come to terms with an Aboriginal, history of this country and ownership of this country, and what happened. So it's breaking down that denial that was, you know, was here for such a long time. But I tell you what, too, when I write these books, I mean, and Carpentaria, that family, the non-Phantom family, Angel Day, they were my friends for 10 years. And so if you want to make Aboriginal friends, read Carpentaria or read Oblivia, and they'll give you some idea about the country.
What you said about the need to find new forms to break out of the cathedral of the novel made me think about the expression of a Kenyan novelist and activist called Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who talks a lot about decolonizing the mind and decolonizing forms of writing. And I'm wondering whether you've had any thoughts or engagement with some of these African authors who've had to go through a similar process. I mean, Watongo is very interesting because he ended up deciding that he was fed up of writing in English and started writing in Kikuyu. And so in both of those ways, I'm wondering whether you've engaged with some of these African authors and had any thoughts about, you know, your own relationship to language and whether English is the language you want to write in, or whether you write in other languages, I guess.
Yes, I read some of his work and other African writers at the time, and this is a long time ago. And I can understand that. I bring Waanyi words and thinking into the works that I do. And I'll tell you that the Waanyi language is an endangered language in this country. There's only a handful of Waanyi speakers who are old people, and it gets less all the time. We're lucky because we have a neighbouring Aboriginal nation language group, the Garawa people. Its language is quite similar, and there's also now Waanyi being taught again in schools in the Gulf of Carpentaria to children. So I don't speak the Waanyi language, and I make a lot of effort to learn and to bring Waanyi elements into my works. But what can I say?
I think we have time for have we already got one? A lady right in the front here.
I'm just wondering, when you talk about Aboriginal self-government, exactly what you mean. I come from South Africa, and when I first heard it, all I could think of was the South African homelands, and that sort of struck me with horror. So I was wondering if you could just expand a little on what vision you had for Aboriginal self-rule.
It comes from ideas of Aboriginal property rights and unsettled questions in the country. It also comes from a number of people who I was working with in Central Australia some time ago. It was they called themselves the Combined Aboriginal Nations of Central Australia. It was led by really strong Aboriginal people of great thinking and understanding and wisdom, and because of what was happening in the Northern Territory, where a lot of money that was to go for Aboriginal, for to create, money that should have been spent for education, housing, roads, water, sewage, all those things was not hitting Aboriginal hands, Aboriginal communities, and that the governance system in the Northern Territory was not a suitable government system for about half of the population, which was Aboriginal people, and the half of the land up there had been returned to Aboriginal people as Aboriginal land. And I don't know what your experiences was in South Africa, and but there is Aboriginal groups across the world who are able to have their own government and sense of having their own direction, rather than having people in Canberra or Darwin directing their future for them, because that doesn't work. If you can't engage with the people on the ground and what their ideas are about themselves and their culture, their realities, they just close off. And that's been the problem, as well as all that money that's been wasted on building nice big parliament buildings in Darwin, or for many years, millions of dollars diverted from money that should have gone to helping people to fix out some of the disadvantage that's been caused over many years from land, from non-settlemental land and other things that have happened, since then. But money that was diverted for millions of dollars to fighting land rights cases against Aboriginal people, money that should have been spent for helping to create better lives for Aboriginal children and families.
We'll have to leave it there, I'm afraid. I just want to say what a treat it was to be able to speak with you today, Alexis, on a red letter day for Aboriginal Australia. I gather David Gupalil just got Best Actor at Cannes. So
Really? That's good. Cheers.